1976, a college kid with no formal training in instrument building walked backstage at a Carlos Santana concert carrying a homemade electric guitar. He had driven hours to get there. He had no appointment, no introduction, and no credentials beyond the guitar in his hands. He talked his way past security, found Santana, and asked one of the most respected guitarists on the planet to play an instrument built by a nobody in a dorm room. Santana played it, and he liked it, but the part of this story that matters is not that Santana said yes that night. It is what Paul Reed Smith did with the next 40 years. Paul Reed Smith built his first electric guitar as a class project at St. Mary's College of Maryland in 1975. He was not enrolled in a Lutherie program. There was no Lutherie program. He was studying mathematics and decided to build a guitar because he wanted to understand how the instrument worked at a structural level. That first guitar was rough. Smith has been honest in interviews about how much he did not know, but the process hooked him completely, and by the time he graduated, building guitars had become an obsession that made everything else feel irrelevant. Smith spent the late 1970s and early 1980s building instruments by hand in a small workshop, selling them one at a time out of the trunk of his car. He would drive to concerts, find the backstage entrance, and offer to let professional musicians try his guitars. It was an insane sales strategy. No marketing budget, no dealer network, no brand recognition. Just a man with a guitar, a car, and a willingness to be told no repeatedly until someone said yes. The Santana connection was the breakthrough that transformed a one-man workshop into a viable business. After that backstage meeting, Smith continued refining instruments and sending them to Santana. By the early 1980s, Santana was playing Smith's guitars on stage and in the studio, and the endorsement carried enormous weight. Santana had spent years playing Gibson Les Paul and SGs. For him to switch to an unknown builder's instrument signaled to the professional guitar community that these guitars were something special. One endorsement from the right player was worth more than any advertising campaign PRS could have afforded, which at that point was no advertising campaign at all. In 1985, Smith incorporated PRS guitars in Annapolis, Maryland, and launched the Custom 24 as his first production model. The Custom 24 was not a random design. It was a calculated answer to a question that had been sitting unanswered in the guitar market for decades. Why did a guitarist have to choose between a Gibson and a Fender? Gibson guitars, with their shorter 24 and 3/4-inch scale length mahogany bodies and humbucker pickups, delivered thick, warm, mid-range heavy tone. Fender guitars, with their longer 25.5-inch scale length alder or ash bodies and single coil pickups, delivered bright, snappy, articulate tone. Players who needed both sounds had to own both guitars. Smith decided they should not have to. The Custom 24 used a 25-inch scale length, splitting the difference between Gibson and Fender almost exactly. The body was mahogany with a carved maple top, echoing the Les Paul construction. But the dual humbucker pickups featured coil-splitting functionality that allowed each humbucker to operate as a single coil, approximating Fender-style brightness when needed. The proprietary PRS tremolo bridge offered vibrato capability with better tuning stability than a vintage Fender synchronized tremolo. The neck profile was a comfortable medium carve that felt familiar to both Gibson and Fender players without directly copying either. And then there was the fit and finish. This is where Smith's obsession made the real difference. In the mid-1980s, Gibson was still emerging from the Norlin era, a period of corporate ownership that had degraded construction quality across the entire lineup. Fretwork was inconsistent, bodies were made from multiple mismatched pieces of wood glued together, finishes were thick and poorly applied. Fender had improved since the CBS sale in 1985, but the American manufacturing operation was still rebuilding its reputation. A new Gibson Les Paul Standard or a new Fender American Stratocaster in 1987 was a solid guitar, but it was not a flawless guitar. Smith treated flawlessness as the baseline. Every PRS Custom 24 shipping from the Annapolis workshop had hand-selected flame maple tops graded for visual consistency and resonance. Frets were leveled and crowned with obsessive precision. Binding was tight and clean. The bird inlay fretboard markers, which became the visual signature of the brand, were cut and fitted individually. When you picked up a PRS in 1987 and then picked up a Gibson or Fender from the same year at the same price point, the PRS felt like it came from a different tier of manufacturing, and in many ways, it did. The guitar industry noticed. Dealers who carried the first PRS instruments reported that customers who came in to buy a Les Paul or a Stratocaster were walking out with a custom 24 instead. The word of mouth was brutal for Gibson and Fender. Here was a brand with zero heritage, zero nostalgia, and zero cultural mythology, outselling established models on pure quality at the point of sale. Through the 1990s, PRS expanded its lineup methodically. The McCarty model, named after former Gibson president Ted McCarty, who became an advisor to Smith, leaned further into the Gibson side of the tonal spectrum with a thicker body and vintage voiced pickups. The CE series offered bolt-on neck construction at a lower price point. The Hollow Body and Hollow Body 2 brought PRS into semi-hollow territory, competing with the Gibson ES335. Each new model filled a specific gap in the market while maintaining the quality standard that had built the brand. Smith also built a relationship with Ted McCarty himself, the man who had designed the Gibson Les Paul, the ES335, the Flying V, and the Explorer during his tenure as Gibson's president in the 1950s and 1960s. McCarty consulted with Smith on guitar design and manufacturing until McCarty's death in 2001. Having the literal architect of Gibson's golden era working with PRS was a symbolic and practical advantage that no amount of money could have purchased. It was a direct transfer of knowledge from the man who built Gibson's legacy to the man who was building its most serious competitor. If you are finding this story interesting, hit subscribe. We cover the real histories behind guitar brands and gear every week. Now let us talk about the decision that almost split PRS in half. In 2001, PRS launched the SE series. SE stood for Student Edition, and the guitars were manufactured in South Korea, not in Annapolis. The prices started below $500, a fraction of the cost of an American-made PRS. For a brand that had built its entire identity on premium craftsmanship and American manufacturing, this felt like a betrayal to some early adopters. Guitar forum threads from the early 2000s are filled with PRS loyalists accusing the company of selling out, diluting the brand, and chasing volume over quality. Smith's counterargument was practical and turned out to be correct. The SE line brought PRS design language, body shapes, pickup voicing, and aesthetic identity to players who could not afford a $2,000 American instrument. A college student buying a $400 SE Custom 24 was experiencing PRS for the first time, and if that experience was positive, they were far more likely to save up for an American-made model later. The SE series created a feeder pipeline that expanded the customer base without cannibalizing the core lineup. The numbers proved it. The SE series became the highest volume product line in the PRS catalog, outselling the American-made instruments by a significant margin. But American-made PRS sales did not decline, they growed. The customers who started on SE guitars graduated upward. The brand that critics said was destroying itself with affordable imports actually strengthened its position across every price tier. The boldest move in PRS history came in 2018 when John Mayer left Fender to collaborate with Paul Reed Smith on the Silver Sky. This was not a humbucker guitar positioned in the middle ground between Gibson and Fender. The Silver Sky was a bolt-on neck, single-coil pickup guitar with a 25.5-inch scale length and a vintage-style tremolo. It was, by any honest visual and tonal assessment, PRS building their version of a Fender Stratocaster. The backlash was immediate and predictable. Fender loyalists called it a copy. Forum commenters posted side-by-side photos of the Silver Sky and a Stratocaster highlighting the obvious silhouette similarities. The criticism was not entirely unfair. The Silver Sky does look like a Stratocaster with a PRS headstock. Smith's public response was that every guitar company builds on the foundational designs that came before, and that the Silver Sky's construction details, electronics, and neck carve were distinctly PRS. But the real significance of the Silver Sky was strategic, not aesthetic. For 3 decades, PRS had occupied the middle ground between Gibson and Fender, building guitars that could approximate both voices. The Silver Sky was PRS planting a flag directly in Fender's territory and saying they could compete there too. It was no longer about splitting the difference, it was about doing Fender's thing on PRS terms. The market response settled the debate. The Silver Sky sold extremely well. John Mayer toured arenas with it. Professional guitarists in pop, blues, and worship music adopted it. Fender's market share in the single-coil bolt-on category did not collapse, but PRS proved it could take bites out of territory that Fender had owned essentially unchallenged since 1954. Today, PRS is the third largest American electric guitar manufacturer behind Fender and Gibson. The company builds instruments across a range from $300 SE imports to $10,000 private stock custom orders. PRS amplifiers, including the HDRX and the Archon, have expanded the brand into the amplifier market. The Annapolis factory employs hundreds of workers and operates at a scale that the trunk of the car Paul Reed Smith of 1980 could not have imagined. But the company faces real questions about its future. The most significant is the founder's problem. Paul Reed Smith is not just the company's founder, he is its identity. Smith still personally oversees guitar design, personally inspects instruments, and personally represents the brand at trade shows and dealer events. His ear, his taste, and his quality obsession are embedded in every decision the company makes. That is the strength that built PRS into what it is. It is also a vulnerability. No company this dependent on a single person's vision has a clean succession plan, and Smith is now in his late 60s. There is also the tension between growth and exclusivity. The SE line expanded the brand, but every step toward higher production volume risks the perception that PRS is no longer the boutique alternative to Gibson and Fender. It risks becoming what it originally positioned itself against, a large manufacturer where consistency and volume gradually erode the obsessive quality that made the brand special, and competition has not stood still. Gibson's post-bankruptcy quality has improved under J.C. Curley's leadership. Fender's American Professional and Ultra series represent the best production Fenders built in decades. Japanese manufacturers like ESP, Ibanez, and Fuji Gengaki continue to produce impeccable instruments. The quality gap that PRS originally exploited has narrowed considerably since the mid-1980s. What Paul Reed Smith proved is that the electric guitar market was never the closed duopoly that Gibson and Fender assumed it was. It was a market waiting for someone obsessive enough, talented enough, and stubborn enough to build a third option that was genuinely better at the point of sale. Smith did not have heritage. He did not have nostalgia. He did not have Jimmy Page or Jimi Hendrix in his back catalog. He had craftsmanship, a clear design thesis, and the audacity to walk backstage at a Santana concert with a guitar nobody had heard of. That turned out to be enough. Whether it stays next without him is the question the next decade will answer.